Hi, welcome to another episode of Brooklyn. Where have you gone? Today's episode is entitled The Video Arcade Phenomena. Now, back in the late 70s, early 80s, our video arcades just kept popping up and they didn't start out of nowhere. I remember the first quarter video arcade game I ever saw. I was coming home to Brighton Beach. I was on, I believe, Coney Island Avenue and Avenue M, and there was a group of kids standing around. You couldn't see what they were standing around, so I went and I looked. And there it was, the first video arcade game I ever remember playing. And it was the original Space Invaders. Now, Space Invaders came out in 1978, I believe. And the original was a really cool game. But that day, I was enthralled watching these kids play it, and I didn't care when I got home. I wanted to play that game. So I waited my turn. I got change of $1, and I promptly lost 4 quarters. The game destroyed me. That just left me more determined than ever to learn how to play it. And I soon found one in my neighborhood, and I got pretty good at it. But right around that time was when the video arcade phenomena started. And Brighton Beach had one called Captain's Quarters. There was also a really big one in Kings Plaza. And as I recall, that didn't last too long, nor did Captain's Quarters in Brighton have an overly long run, because kids being kids, there were a lot of fights, and the older folks, especially in Kings Plaza, the store owners, couldn't have fights breaking out. It was no good for business. If you had police running in and out of Kings Plaza, it kind of disturbed things. So I remember the one in Kings Plaza going first, but since I lived in Brighton Beach, there was Captain's Quarters, and I knew everyone in there. Didn't stop the fights, but we always had a great time. And after, I was in Lincoln High School at the time, and I'd leave school, go home. I was living actually on Coney Island Avenue and Neptune Avenue at the time, and I'd go home and pump quarters into the arcade games in Captain's Quarters. I mean, it was a lot of fun. Some of the games I really remember liking and playing were Space Invaders, the original. Then there was Space Invaders Deluxe. There was Asteroids. Let's see what else. Pokemon and Ms. Pokemon. There was Defender, Galaga, Galaxian, Missile Command. Q*bert, which I have a great story about a few years later on, which I will tell towards the end of this video. Donkey Kong, and one of my favorites as well was Popeye. So, I mean, I must have spent $1,000 in quarters in the time that the arcade was open, but since it was a quarter at a time, it really didn't feel like it. Now, like I said, the downfall of the video game arcade was the tempers of the kids and the business people around it and the older folks around it that had to navigate the fights that broke out outside. And that was the downfall. But while we were there was no better feeling than getting the top score on your favorite game and putting your initials there so your friends could see it, and then try and take it down. The other fun thing was when you tried to turn over the game. Now, right before Space Invaders Deluxe came out, me and all my friends wanted to find out what would happen if you went to the top score and it turned over. Did it keep going? Did it go back to zero? Well, a bunch of us turned it over, and it was a bit anticlimactic. It just went back to zero, if I recall correctly, and then you had a pretty low score. But you knew you did what not many kids did, and you turned that game over, and you were the king or the queen, as the feeling may be. Now, once the arcades closed, there wasn't the big room with all the games, but a lot of the smaller little grocery stores and the newsstands would put 2 and 3 video games in there. You know, it helped their income, and it kept the kids in there buying things. And in smaller amounts of the game meant smaller amounts of kids. So they were all over the neighborhood. There was the pizzeria by Lincoln, Connie's, that had a few games. Now I know there were times where I should have been in class. I was actually near Connie's. It was actually not in Connie's Pizzeria. It was in the candy store next door where those video games. I stand to correct myself. And I was in those candy stores and all those little places with the games a little more than I should have been. And there were times I should have been in class and I was not. But we were playing the games. And it was even more than that. It was a social gathering. We played them together. We played against each other. They wound up in bowling alleys. I remember when I first started bowling in leagues, at that time I was even 28, 29 years old. There was a game, a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle game that had 4 players. That was awesome. So you and your 3 best friends dropped quarters in the games before they went bowling, and we had a good time doing it. Now, the reason these games were so successful, not only were they a place for kids to meet and to socialize, but the home-based video game was not a great thing. It was no more than an expensive toy at the time. The original Nintendo, the 8-bit Nintendo, was the beginning of the home-based video game system craze, and that's what actually killed the arcades and the games in the stores. Nobody was playing them anymore. They were sitting at home and playing for free. But until then, it was a gathering place for us. It was a place that we could meet, we could talk, and we could play in person. As the games got better, it became harder and harder to find the arcade-based versions of the games. And that was the downfall of that, and it led to them disappearing. But I'll always remember it, and I'll remember it very fondly. Now, I promise you a Q*bert story. Q*bert came out a little later. It was one of the games that came out towards the end of the arcade game era. And I used to play it. It was in the bowling alley. It was in other places. I was dating my wife at the time, and I became very good at Q*bert. I always loved puzzle games. So I'd put a quarter in there, play for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, however long the quarter would take. And my future wife would get very upset with me, and she would get mad at me if I ever played the game while she was there, so I wouldn't do it. But this is another example of how we all got together and we did things in Brooklyn way back when. I mean, even at that time, if there was a fight, there's a bunch of kids that pushed around on each other, and afterwards they became friends. And a lot of times the arguments were over who had the next game, because you would put your quarter up on the ridge of the game and you'd call next. Well, some kids would argue whether their quarter was in front of another kid's, and then we would have those little arguments. They didn't last long. They didn't amount to much, but it was all part of being there in person and having that socialization. The video games themselves that required a couple of people to play against. These days, the games are so sophisticated that they blow those games away. They make them look like toys. And kids play with other kids from all over the world, kids they don't know, kids that they never get to meet, and they're never going to know the type of socialization and the type of fun we had even playing video games together. And that is my story on the video arcade phenomena. So, if you like this content and you want to hear more, please hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and this way you can get all the content at one time. And that's it for Brooklyn. Where have you gone?